Some of the challenges that the CAP and I see for elimination. The first thing, of course, is communication to stakeholders, that we set forth both definable short and long-term goals, and that we can define a common terminology for communication. And I think you've seen a lot of that already with Daryl Holdcamp's presentation. And what you're going to find in my presentation, you probably won't see anything new. In fact, it's really almost a compilation of a lot of the slides and ideas that we've seen this morning. Another point is that we really need to develop cost-effective protocols to assess herd status and progress, deliver a menu of elimination options. And that's one thing we've seen today. We have herd closure, we have filtration. And finally, what I want to do is talk about this lower area of ideas. One thing we need to make sure we do during this process of elimination is that we overlay it with the science. And it's to understand how elimination methods succeed, but also oftentimes we need to know why they don't meet our expectations. And I know in the old days we used to call that a failure, but these days we really need to change the language and make it much more positive. Another thing we need to do is explore and integrate new tools to increase effectiveness, decrease time, and lower costs. The one thing that science does is, at the end of the day, good science lowers the costs of things. And then finally, what I'll concentrate on today is the fact we really need to fully fund elimination efforts, recruit and leverage new sources of funding to subsidize efforts, and support the development of new tools, technology, and knowledge. And when Dinah was giving her talk on airplanes, I was sitting back there and saying, oh my gosh, we need airplanes. Because if airplanes will allow us to identify farms better than cars, then that's the tools that we need to be using out in the field. On your agenda, as well as on your little key card, it says change the game. In 2010, USDA will be changing the game, and they will be changing it big time. We now have this new organization called NIFA. And what NIFA has set forth is the idea that they will support longer duration grants, 5 years, they're renewable for 5 years, and look at this, $10 million. They no longer want to support small science, those individual projects that we get from USDA or we have gotten from USDA and the Pork Board, but actually look for long-range, high-dollar projects. These grants must be multidisciplinary, multi-institutional, and even regional in participation, highly focused to address critical issues facing the nation. The large long-term grants will provide fundamental and applied research, extension, and/or education. And what I want to emphasize is this last point. NIFA will be seeking outstanding integrated grant proposals. Large grants will need to have significant extension and/or teaching objectives clearly integrated into the research objectives, not simply added on as an afterthought. The discussions and the presentations that we've seen this morning, that's USDA's definition of extension. So what USDA is demanding us to do in 2010, we're already doing. And so it's going to be a matter of being able to be competitive enough during the funding process to be able to manage this amount of funding. I'm the lazy scientist, and preparing for my talk, I had to go no further than the mind of Dale Polson. And this is the email that he sent me and what he would expected from my talk. We've been talking about the idea of creating a third leg to the funding stool. The first leg being USDA, second leg being producer-run organizations such as the National Pork Board, and then finally a third leg being a private or being a nonprofit foundation that would be supported by private money. And in this email that he wrote me, that this foundation can support not only traditional scientific education extension-like activities, but also support the operational communication and collaboration of working groups conducting area regional projects, as well as enable and encourage the organic planting, cultivation, and growth of more new working groups, along with the collaboration of existing working groups as successful ARC projects expand and merge with each other into larger areas, regions. This is only part of this multi-page run-on single sentence, but Dale, I think it really captures what we're trying to accomplish today. All good ideas are worth stealing, and I steal most of mine from Jeff Zimmerman. Jeff gave an incredible talk back in October when he laid out the history of disease elimination, beginning with the early 1800s and ending with PRV. And the one thing you could synthesize from his talk is the fact that there are really only three essential elements to any good elimination or eradication plan. The first thing is to have a good leadership. Tools, we've seen a lot of tools today, and those tools are rapidly evolving. And then the final part of the puzzle is really the beginnings of a plan. We don't need to have an end-game strategy. We just need to know how to get started, because in any elimination or eradication project, the plan always changes as we gain new knowledge and experience. So when we talk about leadership, we can talk about traditional leaders, producers, government, universities, veterinarians. These are all valuable partners in leading this effort. But one thing we should be thinking about are companies, private entities. The industry has changed in 20 years. And so we really need to look for new areas of leadership. And I was thinking, well, what do companies typically provide? Well, companies typically provide us with a free lunch or a free breakfast. But in reality, I think what the private entities can provide us is something that I would call an integrated business plan for PRRS control and elimination, which includes both short and long-term returns on investment. As it turns out, this is what USDA expects us to do. They are going to give us money, and we are going to show how we have provided some return on their investment. So this is how, in terms of the research game, this is how things have changed. Scott D. was given a lot of credit for 2006 using the word eradication. And I want to give some credit to Mike Murtaugh, who led the CAP 1 effort. Back in 2002, 2003, the first paragraph of the CAP 1 proposal says the only way we're going to control PRRS is to eliminate it. And the reason why we use the term elimination, because in 2002, 2003, if we would have said the word eradication, we would have had our tongues cut out. And so we used elimination as a softer approach to eradication, and really came up with a set of definitions. And it's a set of definitions that I typically use when I talk. Eradication is really a government-led process that is based on laws. Back in 2002, 2003, that was considered draconian and really non-palatable to producers. And so when we, instead of talking about eradication in the PRRS cap, we typically call it elimination. Elimination is really a stakeholder-driven process based on the desire to maintain profitability. And I think that is one of the take-home messages from Paul Yeski's talk. One thing we see is that elimination is varied in scope. We see at the level of a herd, region, super region, and state. But one of the drawbacks is it's typically voluntary. And that's one of the roadblocks that Bob Morrison typically sees in his regional elimination projects. When you have to deal with IACUCs, which I deal with on a routine basis, IACUC can take any project, make it very straightforward, and turn it into a chaotic free-for-all. And because they are imposing rules on you on things they know absolutely nothing about. And that is what I call a good university committee. And sometimes it can be perceived as divisive. So when we talk about this idea of elimination versus eradication, I think we should think about it in terms of having it both ways. I don't think we should be debating any issues. I think what we've seen from all these speakers is really elimination as a process towards eradication of PRRS. Once we can show that elimination is feasible and practical, and I think the one thing we have done is we have shown it's feasible and economically profitable, and we just need to make it practical, then eradication becomes palatable. And I think at the end of the day it's going to be necessary. One thing that the CAP strongly supports is that elimination must have a scientific basis. That's the only thing that we ask. Elimination projects need to be sufficiently subsidized to fully meet all of these scientific and non-scientific goals. And so at the moment, as we initiate these elimination projects, we must understand that the cost of elimination cannot be borne by the individual producer alone. Initially, it really needs to be subsidized. And why does it need to be subsidized? We need to test all those working assumptions. When Gerald Holdkamp comes up and says, test 30 pigs and you're going to have 95% confidence that you will know the status of that herd, as a skeptical scientist, I'm going to have to say, prove it. And I'm going to say, go out and bleed 100 pigs and show me that you've achieved those confidence limits. We need to be able to perform the amounts and types of testing needed to verify herd status. One thing we aren't doing is that we need to recover a bank of those PRRS isolates that we are eliminating. We really need to have a record of their passage, not just the sequence but the actual isolates. These will come in very, very handy in the future when people like me, who are the basic molecular biologists, are going to want to kind of understand how PRRS evolves, also to kind of figure out how we really got into this mess and hopefully avoid other PRRS-like catastrophes in the future. You can never do enough sequencing. Sequencing is not only important for identifying what virus you have, it can also tell you about the evolution of viruses in the field. We need to look for new diagnostic tests and overlay them on top of current elimination efforts. Everybody, I think, has had a slide of a pig chewing on a rope. I actually have one too, but I left it out of this talk. Jeff Zimmerman, oral fluids, that will probably be the next method for doing surveillance out in the field. We also have some new diagnostic technologies such as Luminex, which will improve diagnostics as well as reduce its cost. Critical support for veterinarians. These are the boots out in the field. We really need to get more veterinarians out there, and we need to be able to support them financially so that they can do their jobs. Create new knowledge from each elimination experience. And establish a coordinated infrastructure that communicates across projects. These days, oftentimes, in any type of program you have, communication is what eats up one of the largest costs. And then finally, we need to also be aware that even though we have the tools for elimination, we must focus on things such as education and outreach. As I said before, funding support for these efforts, we think of traditional methods such as USDA and producer groups. But again, I think we need to look for non-traditional sources such as industry. Right now, just to remind the folks of PRRS CAP, we've invested approximately $500,000 during the course of the CAP that will support these regional elimination projects. These projects are coordinated through Bob Morrison. One thing we've done in the CAP in terms of funding these projects is we've created an innovative mechanism. Typically, for any funding agency, they have a funding deadline. That funding deadline is once a year. And then you have to submit an umpteen-page proposal, and if you don't have every piece of that proposal perfectly done, it can get rejected. The only thing that I ask folks who want to be involved in elimination, call Bob. You don't need a proposal, just have a plan. From that plan, Bob will work with you and develop a proposal, and we will make sure that if it meets Bob's criteria If it meets our stakeholder board criteria, then we will find the money to fund it. So anytime, and Bob always cringes because he realizes that there's never enough money. But he and I both were born with 5 kidneys, so we can always cough one up if we have to. These PRRS CAPS projects you've seen, but Barb Straw, Dunya Augsburger, Daryl Holdcamp is also involved. You've seen him talk a little bit, and others talk about risk assessment as a pre-test, protest tool for elimination. There are also some planned project, MONSI, and Bob described a little bit about what's going on in Minnesota, and this is something that we're looking to support in the future. In terms of other non-traditional approaches to supporting research, I'm also involved in something called the PRRS Host Genetics Consortium. And in this consortium, what we've done is we've designed a means in which we can perform long-term, high-risk, high-cost science. And what we've done is we've developed diverse sources of funding, including the National Pork Board, PRRS CAP, companies, and also USDA. To date, collectively, we've been able to put forth $2.5 million towards this effort. And one of the outcomes in making a community effort is you develop resources for the whole community. And that's the one thing we need to understand in science. For us greedy scientists, what's kind of a curious personality trait is that we'd rather own our own nickel than share a dollar. And I think that's one thing we're going to have to think about in the future, is how we can share resources to develop very large pools of funding. As part of this, one of the things that I've proposed that we actually develop a PRRS Foundation to focus on elimination. This would be a conduit for companies and other private entities to support PRRS control and elimination. This would be a non-profit or similar mechanism. And it would provide support for activities typically under-supported by more traditional sources of funding. So this wouldn't be a means in which to replace what we've done in the past, but as a mechanism to kind of fill in some of the blanks, and some of those blanks that we've seen in some of these other presentations. Why a foundation? We need to think about creating an infrastructure of people and ideas that can provide support for elimination efforts. It also provides a neutral platform for integrating the participation of companies with a diverse range of interests. But we can't forget that at the same time we need to have the means in which to promote branding of these activities by the individual contributors. The nice thing about a foundation is that it can be responsive and nimble. It doesn't carry any historical baggage. It's just focused on the problem. Why should it work? And the reason is on a much smaller scale it already has. For those of you who are going to stick around for the rest of the day and tomorrow, we have the International PRRS Symposium. The cost is supported by several companies. We have an executive committee that receives no compensation, not even to cover personal expenses related to organizing the meeting. And as a group, we start organizing this meeting in April, and for every 2 weeks, we have conference call after conference call after conference call. And at the same time, the process receives oversight from an external planning committee. So this is an activity which is important to PRRS. It's supported by a large group of people. It has well-defined goals, and it has a very simple structure in which to work towards making what is considered an excellent meeting. When we talk about what this foundation might do, we talk about activities, but what I want to talk about are active activities as opposed to passive. We think of education. We need to be able to organize these workshops, whether they be related to terminology, developing protocols, etc. We also must think in terms of training fellowships for veterinarians and for students. There's a lot of things we need to learn out in the field, and then we need to be able to train people from the things that we've learned. Outreach. In terms of this passive activity of outreach, we're talking about an active activity, recruitment of new elimination projects. And this goes back to Dale Polson's original email to me. And then finally, communication. Again, communication is not a passive activity, but it's an active activity in terms of coordination. So really, this is kind of my conclusion, and it's how we're going to brand PRRS elimination. And this is what I call the NASCAR approach. And in which case we can see USDA, we can see, of course, the university logo. I actually found a race car logo, and then we can think of large multinational companies.